I'm Bill Lawrence. I'm Professor Emeritus at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, also a research fellow at a Center for Wesley Studies at Duke Divinity School, and I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and a clergy member in the Retired Relationship with the North Texas Annual Conference. As people gathered for the General Conference, the mood was tense. A growing church in some regions was bringing diversity. A cohort of young voices wanted a say in the church's decision-making process. A political bloc had assembled enough votes to dominate the legislation and had majority control over the conference. When a crucial item on the agenda passed by a small margin, the tensions exploded. Some participants began packing to head home. One of them lamented that this might be the end of the church. That's the way it was at General Conference in the year 1808. Methodists coped with that crisis. They remained together. They resisted forces of division. They renewed the church by defining doctrinal standards. They reformed the church by taking actions which protected church doctrine from any willful majority and protected ministers as well as members from being arbitrarily expelled. To achieve this, the Methodists at the 1808 General Conference devised a new strategy. They embraced broader cultures and generations, drawing a 62-year-old bishop named Francis Asbury into alliance with a 26-year-old preacher named Joshua Soule, and electing a bishop named McKendry, who came from the margins of the mission. They recreated Methodism for the next phase of its life with a combination of doctrinal standards and constitutional order that served Methodists well for 160 years. Of course, they did not reach perfection. Success in 1808 did not forestall future crises. Methodism had a dozen splits of various kinds in the century and a half thereafter. And even when they stitched themselves together, there were flaws in the fabric of unity. They waited 148 years before welcoming women into full clergy membership. They reunited Northern Methodists, Southern Methodists, and Methodist Protestants in 1939, but made compromises that institutionalized racial segregation to do it. Still, every time there was a rift or a reunion, each new form of Methodism was a church built as it was in 1808, on doctrinal standards defining its theological basis, and on a constitution decentralizing its governing components. When the United Methodist Church was born in 1968 by merging the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren, its founders adopted doctrinal standards to protect the church from theological incoherence. And they created a constitutional system to prevent tyranny by the episcopacy, by a legislative majority, or by anybody else. Some scholars like to debate what the doctrinal standards were in 1808, but the only two items that are doctrinal standards of the United Methodist Church today are the Methodist Articles of Religion and the EUB Confession of Faith. The Constitution protects them from intrusion by the General Conference. There are other doctrinal statements of the church, but those two doctrinal standards set the theological identity of the United Methodist Church. They define, quote, the negative limits of public teaching in the church, end quote. They say what we cannot teach. Their purpose is not to designate what we must teach. United Methodists have basic beliefs, but have space for differences, debates, and disagreements. Ours is a distinctive theological approach. We cannot teach what our doctrinal standards explicitly prohibit, such as transubstantiation in Holy Communion. Otherwise, our doctrinal standards avoid any, quote, prescription of an inflexible system of doctrine, end quote. The doctrinal standards view the gift of salvation as a process, not as a finished business. They accept God's grace in many forms, including sacred mysteries beyond our control. United Methodism's doctrinal standards revere God's grace as a universal and indivisible gift, both for believers striving to become perfect in love in this life, and for others who have yet to hear a word or see a sign that God loves them. Grace is inseparable into personal and social. It is both. Grace is indescribable without human freedom. It cooperates with free will. Grace is inscrutable in the many ways it comes. Some are constructed into liturgies. Most are deep mysteries. All convey God's love as our church's foundations of faith. The doctrinal standards thereby establish the church theologically, and restrictive rules in the Constitution protect the doctrinal standards from careless neglect or devious acts. In order to alter the doctrinal standards, two of the restrictive rules in the Constitution would have to be amended. First, by a 2/3 vote of the General Conference, and then by a 3/4 vote of the lay and clergy members of the annual conferences. Then the doctrinal standards could be revised or revoked. All this is to prevent theological mischief by the General Conference. But what happens if the General Conference gets mischievous? What happens if the General Conference becomes so obsessed with an issue of church policy that it enters theological realms where the restrictive rules say the General Conference shall not go? What happens if the General Conference, by a legislative loophole or by a devious design, ignores the doctrinal standards in order to express disdain for homosexuality? What happens if the General Conference, obsessed with homosexuality, violates doctrine legislatively by changing the doctrinal standards? I want to show that this theological mischief has in fact happened. I want to present the case that the General Conference has been violating the doctrinal standards for most of the past 5 decades that the denomination has existed. The trouble began with 4 words. At the 1972 General Conference, delegates were discussing the social principles, which state church positions on matters of public policy. The draft text said homosexuals as well as heterosexuals should have their human and civil rights protected. A delegate rose to add an additional fragment. Quote, "Though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian doctrine," end quote. Apart from replacing the word doctrine with the word teaching, the General Conference adopted his amendment, adding those 4 words, incompatible with Christian teaching. Changed more than a social principle. It damaged the general rules that are important in Methodist history. And most important, it altered the doctrinal standards of the United Methodist Church. The 3 general rules say we should be, quote, doing no harm, doing good, and attending upon all the ordinances of God, end quote. The General Conference broke these 3 rules with 4 words that declare the practice of homosexuality incompatible with Christian teaching. The General Conference harmed individual United Methodists and harmed the integrity of the institution. With 4 words, the General Conference disregarded doing good, such as by fostering healthy attitudes about human sexuality in church and society. With 4 words, the General Conference deplored homosexuality without any help from the Scriptures. With 4 words, the General Conference delegates did harm, did not do any good, and dismissed a means of grace that could have helped them do better. But the harm was beyond immorality. The words incompatible with Christian teaching were more than a new phrase in the social principles and more than an attack on the general rules. Those 4 words violated 2 doctrinal standards. The doctrinal damage was both subtle and treacherous. The General Conference altered the two doctrinal standards of the church by inventing the four-word phrase, then vesting it with a claim of authority, and then basing church laws on that statement. In a series of steps lurching onward from 1972, those four words altered United Methodist theology and became a basis for nasty legislation. It was in the 1980 discipline, 8 years after the 72 actions, that the four words appeared in a footnote to a church law. In 1996, the General Conference put a new law in the discipline that assumes the four words have theological authority. The law still says, quote, since the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and so on, thereby prohibiting self-avowed practicing homosexuals from candidacy for ordination in violation of our theological foundations. In 2004, the General Conference made those four words the grounds for a chargeable offense, threatening the credentials of ministers who perform same-sex marriages. In 2019, the General Conference used those four words as an instrument for ordering a bishop to refuse to ordain a minister or to consecrate a bishop who may be a homosexual outlaw in the eyes of the church. In four words, from 1972 to the present day, the General Conference has altered our doctrinal standards, declared the practice of homosexuality to be theologically prohibited. In effect, the General Conference declared the practice of homosexuality to be a theological heresy like transubstantiation. In four words, it damaged three rules, violated two doctrinal standards, and severed the one grace of the Lord. 4, 3, 2, 1 is the formula for the theological mischief of the sort that those General Conference actions cannot do. Doctrinal standards provide the metrics by which all other theological statements of the church must be measured. Doctrinal standards cannot be changed by the General Conference, according to the Constitution. But let's look at an example of how they did it. One doctrinal standard, Article 21 on the marriage of ministers, says, it is lawful for them, as for all other Christians, to marry at their own discretion, as they shall judge the same to serve best to godliness. This doctrinal standard blends the Wesleyan theological principles of freedom and holiness. When a church law limits the marriage of any United Methodist on the basis of gender, it is more than a law, it is an intrusion into theological and doctrinal territory. The church law that prohibits same-sex marriages by clergy or threatens clergy credentials for performing same-sex marriages changes our doctrinal standard on marriage by limiting individual discretion and personal judgment about godliness. The doctrinal standards are about freedom and holiness. This is a theological violation of that article. United Methodists who reject that conclusion are welcome to seek to amend two restrictive rules, and then, if those pass, to amend the doctrinal standards themselves. And yet, does doctrine matter? In the mid-19th century, when Methodist law said women could not be ordained to preach, Phoebe Palmer challenged that law theologically. She said it put the will of the church into conflict with the will of Christ. She said church leaders who enforced laws against women needed to say how they would justify depriving the world of God's grace when preached by women. She said, what account will you give to the head of the church for restricting this use of the endowment of power? Who can take care of this theological error? Not the judicial council. They can't do theological work. But it could be the Council of Bishops and their Committee on Faith and Order. It could be the annual conferences whose decisions about whom to ordain are based on who passes the theological exams. Asbury, Soule, and Palmer told us the Constitution and laws rest on theological standards, and we ignore them at our peril.